Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, so glad you're with us on the Three Martini Lunch. And as promised for a number of days, it's time for our look at the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter, and what we say is an honest look at the life and legacy of Jimmy Carter. From most of the left-wing mainstream media outlets, it's pretty much been a hagiography, and from some on the right, it's been terrible president, good guy. Others have been far more harsh. One of your colleagues, Philip Klein, got a lot of attention for his column the day Carter died, saying he was a terrible president, even worse, ex-president, which is usually not the narrative we see from the mainstream media. So we're going to look at it good, bad, and crazy here from a life of 100 years, by far the longest lived person to ever be president of the United States. And so let's start with the good, and there are some goods. First of all, Jimmy Carter served our nation, as far as we know, very honorably in the United States Navy for a number of years, was on track for a pretty high rank and until his father died, and he went back home to run the family peanut farm. You also have to give him credit for being an underdog who got the Democratic nomination in 1976. This was, of course, after a four-year term as governor. Back then, Georgia had the same rule Virginia has now. You couldn't run for re-election. And so Carter starts off as this underdog, but he has these really young, really smart staffers like Hamilton Jordan and pollsters like Pat Goodell, who helped him kind of hone his message at a time post-Watergate that people wanted someone who was seen as decent and honest after Nixon and so forth. And Ford, of course, was stained with the pardon of Richard Nixon. And so that got Jimmy Carter kind of an early edge. He won the Iowa caucuses, which for a generation or two kept Iowa caucuses as the first contest. So, Jim, you can blame Jimmy Carter for that, I guess. And then in terms of being president, he narrowly defeated Gerald Ford. Very close races in Ohio and Hawaii could have flipped the race had they gone slightly differently. The crowning achievement, of course, of the Carter presidency is the Camp David Accords, getting Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin to agree to non-hostilities, if not super warm relations. But it's a peace deal that still survives more than 45 years later. On the economic front, and there's much more to say about that in the Bad Martini, there was deregulation in terms of the airlines and trucking and things like that. And then in terms of his post-presidential career, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the Crazy Martini, he did some good things in terms of ending guinea worm and river blindness and some of these other diseases in third world countries that had been a real big problem. And the other thing I'll say about his post-presidential career in a good way is the Carter-Baker Commission, which nobody pays attention to anymore, saying that don't rely too much on absentee ballots. They're the easiest way to commit election fraud. So much has also been said about Carter's faith over the past few days, and that is appropriate. There is no doubt that Jimmy Carter's faith was a major influence in his life and to some extent on his policies. I would urge you to note, as you watch the coverage, though, how the media have no trouble lauding a politician's faith as long as those politicians end up embracing the left's agenda like Carter did. It's when their faith leads to conservative positions that the media suddenly start hyperventilating about the separation of church and state. Carter was, by all accounts, a faithful husband for 77 years, which is to be highly commended. So, Jim, there are certainly some things to appreciate about Jimmy Carter.
Yeah, I was going to say, from the moment we during the break, we're like, should we do a live, should we do a show interjecting on this? When someone who is famous passes, there's this argument of don't speak ill of the dead. And I think you should walk that tightrope, meaning that, there's no need to rub salt in the wounds. There's no need to go off, talking about how much you couldn't stand him. On the other hand, you can't talk about Jimmy Carter without talking about his presidency. And if you run around saying Jimmy Carter was one of America's most beloved and successful presidents of all time, you're not really informing the public. You're not really remembering things clearly. And I think you have to acknowledge. But because our traditional format is good, bad, and crazy, we will talk, dear listeners, about the good parts of Jimmy Carter's record. Don't worry, it won't take long. But we're not going to ignore it. We're not going to gloss over it. The two that stood out to me, and I had been seeing some of the folks at Reason magazine talk about this as the death of Jimmy Carter approached. He was actually better on deregulation than we remember, most notably for deregulating the airlines. And we kind of have this narrative in our heads, largely accurate, but with some exceptions of government growing and becoming large and unresponsive under Democratic presidents and also under Gerald Ford, we should be honest. And that Reagan comes along as the great cutter of red tape. And they're somewhat true, but actually Carter had gotten the ball rolling in a couple areas in there, and I think that Carter deserves credit for that. And secondly, there's no getting around the fact that the first 2 years of Jimmy Carter's presidency on foreign policy, other than the peace deal between Israel and Egypt that you mentioned, generally it was thought of as the Hindenburg crashing into the Titanic. One disaster on top of another. But we should point out that after attempting to enact the détente policy of continued mutual peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union, increasing acts of aggression, and most notably the invasion of Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter recognized he had been snookered. He recognized that his previous stance had been fairly naive, and he did get tougher. Now, boycotting the Summer Olympics in 1980 was generally seen as more of a punishment to the U.S. athletes than it was to the Russians. But on a variety of fronts, most notably discussion of Eastern Europe, Carter did get tougher. So he was kind of a born-again hawk on that front. So that's what I got. And of course, I should point out Habitat for Humanity and all of his work building houses. And, look, it must be very difficult to be a former president at middle age and to know you have a lot more time on this earth and what are you going to do with it? And Jimmy Carter decided to build homes for people who needed them. And there are a lot worse ways to spend the rest of your time. And so for that reason, God bless you, Jimmy Carter.
No, absolutely. Yeah, the Habitat for Humanity story is great. And most of the people I've ever known who interacted with him found him to be a decent guy. So, but there is also...
You knew that, but we were going to have a bigger butt than Sir Mix-a-Lot.
So the other side of the Carter presidency, another legacy, is next. All right, Jim, you mentioned it. The Carter presidency was not good. We'll get to his post-presidency in our third martini, but just pretty much across the board, there were many, many, many disasters, almost more than you could imagine could happen in a 4-year span. But the top of the line, of course, is Iran in so many different ways. The Shah was not popular in Iran, not particularly popular in this country. But compared to the alternative, obviously he was preferred. Carter, very, very weak, very unsure about what to do in that situation. So ultimately the Shah, he gets cancer. He has to leave. He's forced out. Then you got the Ayatollah Khomeini, who's this obvious radical. Of course, promised not to be, but as soon as he got there, he was. We helped the Shah get to a safe place. So then he hates the United States, takes the U.S. Embassy, 52 hostages for 444 days. Of course, Desert One, which I think he tried to be bold in getting people rescued, ends in disaster due to the sandstorms and everything else out there. But it's not just that. Iran has been an absolute menace on the world stage for 45 plus years now. You had Iran infiltrating the Iraq war, killing our guys left and right. And just it's been an absolute disaster in the region, influencing all these terrorist groups, using Syria basically and Lebanon as its proxies for a long time. Not so much Syria now. We'll see about that, I guess. Economy-wise, you had stagflation, no economic growth. You had serious inflation. You had interest rates through the roof. I think it was around 20% at one point. You think they're bad now. I mean, try buying a home back then. You had the energy crisis, gas lines, only certain days you could go. And then when you went, you could only buy so much, rationing the gas. Also in the energy crisis, his speech to tell everybody to turn down your thermostats and wear sweaters. The Panama Canal, we've talked about that a little bit lately, at
back
least on
news.
social media. Yes, exactly.
Hot topic these days.
Suggesting we should take it back. That was one of the reasons I think Reagan got a lot of momentum, in addition to running close to Jerry Ford in 76. Carter giving that away for $1. Not a good deal, obviously. His inability to stop the spread of communism. He ran his foreign policy basically on human rights. And so he decided that people who weren't great, it was okay if they went, only be replaced by far worse people. Nicaragua, for example, the Sandinistas come in, the communists run there, and they're always the kindest, gentlest people. The Soviets in Afghanistan, again, showing weakness mainly by boycotting the summer games in Moscow. You had the grain embargo there. That hurt U.S. farmers. And so in the end, Jim, you're not misunderstood when you lose your attempt for re-election, 44 states to 6, and give up 489 electoral votes. I mean, that's worse defense than Oregon in the Rose Bowl yesterday. So it's just obvious that the Americans saw how weak and ineffective Jimmy Carter was as a president, and Ronald Reagan came around at the perfect time for him and the country.
So there's an early episode of The Simpsons in which they unveil a statue of Jimmy Carter. And someone in the crowd reacts, "Jimmy Carter, that's history's greatest monster." And we laugh because it's obvious that Jimmy Carter, for all of his flaws, was not history's greatest monster. But see, Jimmy Carter fans, see how nice we're being to him on this podcast? But the fact that America was in such rough shape in 1979 and 1980 was like that's the joke that people even in Springfield, whatever state it's in, would see a statue of Jimmy Carter and react with shock and horror. That's how strong the memories were. You mentioned the Iran hostage crisis, and to his credit, or he was attempting to negotiate the release all the way up to the finale. And there's a picture of Carter in the Oval Office, surrounded by a bunch of his aides, and Walter Mondale, his vice president, is kind of sitting off to the side, and he has this look. His face is in his hands, and he has this look of utter exasperation. There's like a thought bubble almost above his head of, I can't believe I work with these idiots. I don't know. The frustration must have, just like this sense of they've lost re-election, but maybe we can do this one last great thing before we leave office. And I think you put it very well. That like when you lose 44 states, that the country's rendered its verdict. It was not close. It was he gave his concession speech while the polls were still open on the West Coast. And there's this famous story of people turning away, people who were going to vote for Jimmy Carter. He's conceded the race. Why am I going to vote? And that the agreed that hurt down ballot Democrats in a bunch of those places. And look, the country rendered a firm verdict. And even if Ronald Reagan hadn't been that great, sometimes it's the mistakes and problems of the previous guy that provide you that enormous opportunity. And I think that's why, when people started talking about Carter after his passing, there's nothing wrong with saying, pointing out what he did right and missing him and trying to speak up. But like in the end, he was a failed president. And there are two things, the irony is that if Mondale himself had not run and lost 49 states, then I think Jimmy Carter's 44 state loss would be seen as like, oh man, that was a drubbing. That was the butt kicking for, of all time. Although people pointed out McGovern did have a similar landslide loss a few years earlier. But I kind of feel like the loss of 1980 kind of fades into the background with the starkness of the verdict of the American people in 1984. And I think also just the sense that, if you ask conservatives today, who's the worst president, a lot of them are going to say Joe Biden. And boy, has he made a strong case in the last couple of, last couple of weeks. Some might say Obama. There are probably some old enough to say Bill Clinton. They still remember, all of the scandals. But Jimmy Carter was the first modern, dare I say, failed president or severely disappointing president, however you want to characterize it. This, the country looked at this and said, no, this did not work for us. You left us in worse shape than we did 4 years earlier. And there's no getting around that. And that is a huge part of the Carter legacy. I
think it's probably right around the time George Bush, the elder, had at least wrapped up the nomination. He hadn't had the convention yet. The Republican Party, I still remember them running this ad of, tell them you remember. And it had pictures of the gas lines and the hostages and all this thing of it was only 8 years ago how bad it was under Democratic leadership. And this is why you need to stay the course with Republicans. And obviously that helped George H.W. Bush. A lot of people saw it as maybe going to be Reagan's third term and so forth. But as you pointed out in the Jolt the day after he died, most people don't remember now. A lot of people don't. I mean, you and I are kind of at the very fuzzy edge of remembering the Carter years, and we're not that young anymore. So anybody younger than us is going to have virtually none other than what they've maybe heard from their family members. So it's kind of an important time to set the record straight on this stuff, not to do it pejoratively. It was a lousy 4 years, and we kind of got bullied around the world. And we saw a very different strategy from Ronald Reagan over the next 8 years. So,
Greg, one of the meaner but darkly funny jokes I've heard in the last few days is, as listeners probably know, Jimmy Carter will be lying in state in the Capitol for a couple of days. If your license plate ends in an even number, you should arrive on Monday, and if it's an odd number, on Tuesday. Now, some listeners are hearing that and laughing hysterically. Some don't get that. And the idea was that back in the 70s, during the worst of the gas crisis, you couldn't buy gas on certain days. You had to, depended on your license plate, and there were people siphoning gas out of each other's cars in the middle of the night. It was, I don't want to take us too far down a segue, but there's an interesting argument that baby boomers remember the 60s. They remember Woodstock, remember peace, love, smoking weed, and, really loose hippie chicks. And they remember all those good times. And the 70s were when everything that had started in the 60s went really, really wrong. By then, 1980, Reagan gets elected, things are back on track again. the 70s were such a chaotic time in American life, and there were so many domestic terrorism incidents. But I think about, you and I are roughly the same age, and I periodically am glad that my parents had me at a time when I think a lot of Americans felt like the world was falling apart, and never mind the fears of nuclear war and stuff. The example that stood out to me, and I tweeted about this the other day, Patty Hearst, America's sweetheart heiress, this sweet, very attractive young woman, gets kidnapped, ironically by the Manson gang. This might be pre-Jimmy Carter, but this is kind of emblematic of the social chaos of the 70s. So she's abducted, and a year later, she returns as this brainwashed cult bank robber, posing and saying she supports the Symbionese Liberation Army. She's listened to their messages, and she's become one of them. And I can just think about how middle America feels when something so evil can come along and brainwash her. You must have felt like anything could happen the next day, that it was utter chaos. And David Frum wrote a very good book about the 70s entitled How We Got Here. And it was kind of this recognition that in the 70s, things had gotten so wrong and gone so terribly wrong that by, Ronald Reagan, who had been this allegedly crazy cowboy warmonger movie star, they were willing to roll the dice on him. And I think that roll of the dice paid off pretty well.
Cutting the deficit seems simple. It's just not easy. The Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski. Every day, Chris helps unpack the connection between politics and the economy and how it affects your wallet. Like dieting or saving money, cutting the deficit is simple. It's just not easy. Cutting the deficit is not so much about cutting personnel. It's about cutting the money they hand out. Whether it's happening in D.C. or down on Wall Street, it's affecting you financially. Be informed. Check out the Watchdog on Wall Street podcast with Chris Markowski on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Crazy elements in a couple different ways here, some more fun than others. Jimmy Carter is often lauded for his post-presidential efforts to achieve world peace, particularly Mideast world peace. But a closer look at some of that is not going to help him very much. First of all, this is Scott Jennings the other day on CNN talking about how Jimmy Carter approached other countries in the Middle East at the time the U.S. was building the coalition for the Gulf War in the early 90s.
In the run-up to the Persian Gulf War, he wrote letters
I know about this.
to all of our allies and to Arab states, asking them to abandon their cooperation and coalition with the United States of America. If it's not treasonous, it's borderline treasonous. And so I hear what you're saying about the humanitarianism, but when you're an ex-president and you have served in that office, I think you have a duty to the United States and only to the United States. And when he did that and other instances, to me, it showed that he cared more about his own legacy than he did about the country, and I think that is wrong.
And then there's the issue of Israeli-Palestinian peace talks, and this is, I think, several years after Hamas was elected to lead at least the Palestinians in Gaza. And here's Carter explaining to Piers Morgan on CNN, which tells you how long ago this was, how he sees Hamas and Israel approaching this issue.
I've met several times with Hamas leadership, and I think they are willing to accept Israel to exist peacefully within the 67 borders or some modification of those borders. But the first step has to be to bring Hamas and Fatah together so they can have another honest election. That is a major premise, and I think the 67 borders between the two with some modifications will lead to a two-state solution.
The pre-67 borders are a total non-starter. I don't know why he's even pushing that, but the idea that Hamas is the more fair broker here is just absurd. And then there was this after the 2016 election, after John Meacham at some panel asked him what he thought about allegations of Russian interference.
Well, the president himself should condemn it, admit that it happened, which I think 16 of the intelligence agencies have already agreed to say. And there's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election. And I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered.
And Meacham then asks him whether Trump's an illegitimate president, and Carter laughs and says, well, I guess I can't take it back now since I just said it. So Jim will get to some other things in just a second, and obviously did a lot of good work through the Carter Center. We mentioned his work with healthcare in third world countries, Habitat for Humanity, and elsewhere. But in terms of the Middle East, which was his signature accomplishment as president, getting in the way more than actually helping in a lot of ways.
So it was only actually, I'm going to say a few years ago, maybe it was a bit more than a few years ago, I read about how Richard Nixon had spent his post-presidential life after having been forced to resign after the disgrace of Watergate. And I was fascinated to learn that as an ex-president, Richard Nixon kind of threw himself into foreign policy and would meet with foreign leaders. And generally, like, there was photo ops, but he didn't generally do a lot of, public statements about it. And what it turned out was that Nixon, particularly with like-minded administrations that followed him, but even without it, he could play bad cop to the president's good cop. There's certain things that a president can't say to another foreign leader that Richard Nixon could. The president would have to say, we have some concerns about what you're doing. Richard Nixon could go there 2 months later and say, what the hell are you doing? Don't you understand how you are screwing us over and you're going to, it's going to blow up. And, he could communicate messages, and that he could be this back channel to foreign leaders. And it was not the official position of the United States. It was not the official statement of the U.S. government, but it was a useful line of communication for all of his successors. And it's almost like Jimmy Carter is this twisted funhouse mirror of that, except it's like Jimmy Carter still felt like he was president and still felt comfortable kind of quasi-negotiating with often hostile foreign regimes, attempting to get hostages everywhere. Because he and Jesse Jackson were the two you could pretty much guarantee to meet with someone after the American president had insisted we do not negotiate with terrorists.
Right.
It often felt like Jimmy Carter, well, I will. And North Korea, a whole bunch of times where an administration would be trying to put a policy of isolation and to get leverage over them by refusing to meet with them and to get them to make concessions in order to get the meeting. And Jimmy Carter's like, I'll meet with you. I'll give you that recognition you want. And unfortunately, that I think complicated the foreign policy of many of his successors. And I just point out, when he says Trump didn't actually win in 2016, God, Greg, could you imagine if other presidents started saying that we're not legitimate winners, and that where could that lead? What's the worst case scenario? I suppose I should be glad, as far as I know, Jimmy Carter didn't go off on the Diebold machines in Ohio in 2004, or I got to look up whether he said selected, not elected, about George W. Bush and all that stuff. But looking back and saying, at the time when George H.W. Bush is trying to put together and manage this coalition against Saddam Hussein to stand up against this, straight up aggressive territorial conquest. And Jimmy Carter's going around the world and writing letters and meeting people, say, don't help us, whatever you do, turn against us. Yeah, I can imagine people would, make the comparison of treason to that. So, look, this is all part of the full legacy. And Phil Klein got a lot of grief for writing something about, basically the most scathing assessment of Jimmy Carter as president and former president. And Phil makes the argument that he's worse as a former president than he was as a president. Greg, I think we can all agree that's a really high bar to clear.
That's
really not an easy thing to do. I think Phil makes a pretty strong argument for it, but really just, you want to give 2 gold medals to whether you were worse as a president or as an ex-president.
Yeah, when it's neck and neck in that department, it's not good for Jimmy Carter. I think, not on every issue. I don't necessarily say that on the Middle East, but on some issues, I think he meant well. And just wasn't good at it. Other times, I think he enjoyed being a thorn in the side. One area where I think he did some damage as well is, and he probably meant well, was going to these questionable countries and acting as an election monitor and almost always saying, looks good to me.
Yes.
Including Venezuela with Hugo Chavez. And like, come on, man. But Jim, without him, we would not have had Billy Beer.
There you go. Glad for that. This is how I wrapped up the Morning Jolt on this. I think whether you're the world's biggest critic of Jimmy Carter or whether you're the world's biggest fan of Jimmy Carter, I think everyone would agree he did the best he could. And his critics would say, yes, that was the problem. That was as good as you could get from him. That's,
Indeed.
I'm starting to think about, was it Twisted Sister, maybe to quote? If that's your best won't do.
No question about it. Our condolences to the Carter family as they go through this, I'm sure, exhausting week to come here in Washington and everything else. So in the end, husband, father, grandfather, it's a significant time. Anytime a former president passes, it doesn't happen very often. And he's only the second one since the mid-2000s other than older George Bush that we've had recently. So that's our honest look at the 4 years of Jimmy Carter. So we're back to our usual good, bad, crazy in our next edition. Jim, I'll talk to you then.
See you next time, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Please be sure to subscribe to the 3 Martini Lunch. If you don't already, tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a great weekend and join us again on Monday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.